All right, we're up and running. We had left off class last week talking about Dada, and I used to not like Dada. Now I'm a big fan of it, and I think the main reason why I'm a big fan of Dada is that I really firmly believe that making art is an intellectual pursuit. And one of the things that Dada did was to put the ideas first. It's very much about, I think, the movement and the work that the artists create forefront issues that artists need to deal with. What does it mean to be an artist? What defines a work of art? What is your role as a thoughtful individual? That art and creativity, through the history of art, is more than just aesthetics, right? That art is an intellectual pursuit that really lies at the core of how we engage with our world and should alter the way in which we think about and engage with that world. And of all of the movements of the 20th century, I think Dada does this as good as any. They really do forefront this idea about. And if you think, and by making art that they thought wasn't art, it really doesn't that by itself begin to call into question where do we put the parameters, right? If you're going to say that this is art, this is not art, then you've got to have a pretty good idea of what you think it is, right? And so anyway, we were looking at the stuff from Zurich, and it becomes an international movement pretty quickly, right? Starts in Zurich because of the war, because Zurich in Switzerland is right in the heart of Europe. Everybody else is fighting, right? But not Zurich. And a few other places are at peace as well. And it's kind of interesting what happens if you sort of reflect back on what we've been learning in this first 10 weeks of class. The places that weren't engaged with World War I came up with some pretty amazing stuff. Piet Mondrian in Holland, right, really hits his stride during the war. Suprematism in Russia, right? Kandinsky's flip toward constructivism in Russia during the war, right? And now Dada in Switzerland, and eventually we'll see in New York City, right? Is also a reaction to the war. So it really is sort of a fascinating thing, this, right? So the other major center, as I mentioned, during the war, where Dada takes foothold, is in New York, right? And that's because, again, we didn't enter the war. We were neutral until 1917. Now, I don't think I got very far on this, right? We sort of just got it up there and stopped. Is that about right? That's not, I couldn't remember, right? Marcel Duchamp is a French artist, but he moves to New York in 1915, right? His work had already been shown in New York. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It had been at a major show in 1913, 1912, where it was a huge sort of scandal. And he kind of liked that idea. So he moves to New York, makes it his home for the majority of the rest of his life, from 1915 on until he dies in the 1960s. He lives for a good long time. And so this work of art was made while he was working as an immigrant in New York. And all it is, and again, this idea of Dada's idea about anti-art, but also the Dada idea about chance. You just come on something and there you are, right? You fall upon it and there you are. So what this is, for ladies, right? This is a men's toilet, right? Which you're not going to see as often as Seth and I are, right? But it's a standing urinal. And all he's done, Duchamp as the artist, is to apply himself to it in a way. So he took the toilet. I don't even know if he took it off the wall himself, right? He probably found it in a junk shop, right? Like Community Forklift or something. And he put it up on end. So the bolts that you see on the left, and barely on the right, were meant to where it's bolted to the wall, right? Water would then come in the pipe on the front here, and water would go out the pipe on the back, right, through the bottom. So that's the basin now facing you. So what he's done is, by extracting it from its original context, what he's done is to destroy its original use, right? And that means once the original utilitarian use, that's redundant. The original use of the object is gone. one has to look at it differently. One has to understand it as simply as a shape rather than as a utilitarian object, right? And by calling it fountain, he reveals something about himself that we're going to see in every Duchamp we look at, which is that he's got a wicked sense of humor. Because fountains spray water. Toilets receive liquid, right? So he's renamed it in a way that also subverts its original intention, subverts its original use, right? Now, again, with Duchamp's sense of humor, and he signs it, right? And he signs it with a pseudonym, not with his own name, but with R. Mutt and the date, which again is sort of making anti-art. You know, it's not about him really, but in a way it kind of is, and we'll talk more about that, right? Right, okay, let's see, why is that not moving forward for you guys? Try that again. Still not moving forward for you. Still not moving forward for you. Did I lose my Wi-Fi? Hang on a second, let me see. I still got Wi-Fi. Why is the this not doing what it's supposed to do? Like it's going forward on my screen, but not... Literally going forward. Visually. Figuratively. Going forward on my screen, but not for you. This is really a nightmare. One of those, you know, Karen was saying this morning, I wish I could just call in sick. We don't get to call in sick like you guys do, you know? We have to be really sick. We can't just no. You've all done it. You don't want to go to class. You say you're sick. I was a student too, I know. There's certain days just I don't want to go to class. And this is making me wish I stayed home. Freaking heck. Heck. Oh, heck. I don't know what that means. Is it always blinking? I don't pay that as much attention. I look at you guys, not it. Is that what it says? Not receiving? Right. No, I think it's a PowerPoint thing, because I think my PowerPoint is going crazy. So here's something I'm going to have to do here. I'm going to try this to start this again. I'm going to try to start this again and see what happens. Yes, PowerPoint. So hang on a second. Close that. Get this. Something. Right? Yeah, there's some. It's. Hang on. Let's go back. Now. Try it again. Try this again. Yes, it changed. So now we got to make sure we're still recording. So I'm going to stop the recording and start a new one, and I'll stitch them together. Yeah, it looks like it's okay. Okay, it looks like it's fine. Okay. Duchamp, with his sense of humor, and goodness knows I could use one today, called these objects that he happened upon, that he reused, repurposed, he called them ready-mades, because he felt that the world had made it for him already, right? And it was really his job was to go out there in the world and see what's there. In fact, there's a story about early in his career. He's back in Paris with Fernand Léger. Remember the sort of multicolored drum-like forms, machine forms. He's a purist. And they go to this aviation show, airplane technology. And he looks at a propeller, a big wooden propeller, and he says to Léger, "Do you think either of us will ever make anything as beautiful as that?" And it's the idea that there's things out there that are just, sort of really fascinating, wonderful to look at and think about as forms that aren't really being put out there as art. And his job as the artist is to turn that which is not art into art, and therefore to question the distinction between art and non-art. Right? And he even said at a certain point he wanted to get away from making art to just simply sort of communicating ideas, right? So these he calls ready-mades, right? They are ready-made for the artist. Now, in doing that, he's using a pun, because he's living in New York, so he's speaking in English, right? What's a ready-made, Hunter?
Like for fashion?
Yes.
Oh, ready to wear? So it's just kind of like stuff that can go off the runway.
It's rack, right? For a man, a ready-made suit's the difference between a ready-made suit and a bespoke suit. I wear like a 44 reg, right? That's my suit size. But I will never be able to afford to have somebody measure my neck and measure my chest and give me that's called a bespoke suit, right? A tailored suit. So ready-mades are mass-produced, right? It's a little bit different than pret-a-porter in that it's, pret-a-porter is a little bit higher end than that. But a rack suit is like you buy it at Macy's, right? And it's, and sort of one size fits all. And that's kind of behind his thinking in calling these things ready-mades. They're kind of one size fits all, right? They are mass-produced, they're ready. And again, what makes this so much Dada is it's not about his hand, right? It's just that these things are out there and he's seeing them. And for art, with, either the things he saw in the forest or the paper dropped, right? It's not about craftsmanship anymore, right? Art isn't. Art is about the thought process, right? And on a certain level, what Duchamp is doing is taking that a step further by simply not signing his name. Now, when we think about the signature on this, we have to wonder whether or not it has meaning. Why did he choose R. Mutt as a name? Obviously, again, it's a play on words, right? What's a mutt? A mongrel dog, a dog of no breed, no particular breed, right? So it's certainly not like a poodle or Labrador, right? It's a mutt, right? I've never had anything but a mutt, right? And they're the best dogs you could ever get. They're nicer, they're better to train and all that. That's not what he's thinking about, though. He's thinking about the idea of the status of the artist on a way. He's kind of diminishing that because, again, one of the central Dada themes was to get to a sense of an anti-art. So this whole artistic status that had built up from the Renaissance on, right? Leonardo da Vinci, Rubens, right? The court artist, the artist as genius, right? The artist is having a status above everyone else. Even though he's interested in artistic ideas, he's also interested in sort of undercutting this idea of what it means to be an artist and what kind of status it might bring you, right? So, again, that's that anti-art idea. At the same time, Armut, if you say it out loud, is, in German, the word for poverty. Armut means poverty in German. And so when you read Armut out loud, and Duchamp is multilingual enough to get this, right? He's also making a play on richness, the work of art for sale in the gallery versus poverty. Maybe even talking about the fact that he's making works of art that are really challenging like this, because the traditions of Western art are now impoverished, right? Spent force. Why keep doing things the way they've always been done? That's a dead end, right? So Armut is maybe the potential there for traditional painting. So it's multi-layered comment. He loves playing with words. We'll see this throughout his career. Beatrice Wood was a lover of Duchamp, a Dada artist in her own right, and she wrote a defense in the journals when there was an outcry over this. As you might imagine, even today, 100 years later, it looks a bit like too much, right? Outcry in 1917, Beatrice Wood wrote a defense. Whether Mr., and she calls him Richard Mutt. So it's a made-up name, right? But she says his name is Richard Mutt. So whether Mr. Richard Mutt, and I love that, right? Rich Mutt, right? A play on words that way, right? Whether Mr. Richard Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance, she writes. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared. Under the new title and the new point of view, he created a new meaning for the object. Now, if you think about that last phrase, he created a new meaning for the object. That's what all art does, right? When you make an observational drawing of a tree, you are creating a new meaning for that object in your drawing. There's more to the work of art than just a faithful observation and description. There's a meaning that you are using that object for to try to convey. You are giving it new meaning. he is taking it to the nth degree, right? He's really pushing that envelope about as far as it can be pushed. Now, what's interesting is we now know, 100 years after 1917, that Beatrice Wood did not write that Duchamp wrote it, using her name, and she's in on it, right? She's all fine with it, right? And this is one of a number of different times when he adopts. She really exists, right? It's not like he made these drawings as her, right? There really is a woman named Beatrice Wood, and he wrote it in her name, and he's not like making her complicit in something. She's in on it, right? But he basically wrote it, and so he's basically saying, this is what I meant, right? This is the whole idea behind it. It's not like she got it. I think she did, but that's not the point, right? And it's one of a number of different times we're going to see with Duchamp that he will adopt a woman's persona to make statements and do things, right? And again, I think he's questioning every presumption that we have. And this is part of the reason I like Duchamp so very much. These famous works he started making even before he got to New York, these ready-mades, right? So the bicycle wheel is simply the front fork of a bicycle, taken out of the stem, right, out of the steering column stem, drilled a hole in a stool and jammed it through, right? And there it is, and it can spin. One of the very, very first kinetic sculptures, right? Playing with it in space. And again, the same idea, right? He's removing it from its original context and denying its utilitarian function. The bike wheel can no longer work as a bike wheel. The chair can no longer work as a chair, right? Because of the way he's grouped them together. Now, his inspiration is almost certainly synthetic cubism, right? If you think about Picasso and Braque in that second phase of cubism, where they're starting to take wallpaper, right? Bits of fabric, sometimes buttons and sequins, and sticking them onto the surface of something, you're basically on the path that leads us here, which is that you found something out there and you're going to repurpose it from that into something else that means something different. What Picasso and Braque did was they tried to make it mean the same thing it came from, right? So you get wallpaper from the bar you're sitting at, or pieces of a beer label, right? Things that remind you of tickets to see the theater, right? But they put them back together in a way that reminds you of the context it came from. It reestablishes the link. And what Duchamp has done is to realize that within that there's something else, because now it's got its own meaning independent from where it came. And that meaning comes from, as he wrote in The Guise of Beatrice Wood, that meaning comes from what the artist does with it. He changes the meaning. Right? And so he wants to change the meaning that much more radically. Right? He even said when he saw that propeller, right, he says, can we start to make works of art that aren't works of art? And these to this day remain very challenging works. Right? I could show you more of the ready-mades, but I want to show you some more of these conceptual things. This all pulls together. What's interesting about Duchamp's work as a group is that it really all kind of starts to coalesce around some of these ideas, and these different things that he's doing make sense side by side. So this is called the 3 standard stoppages. Again, he started this in Paris. And what he did was, with this work, is that he's using Dada ideas of chance. And what he's trying to do is question standard ways of thinking, standard modes of rationality, and standard ways of measuring, a very rational thing to do, measuring the world. So what he did was he took 3 pieces of string and he cut each one of them to be exactly 1 meter long. Right? Then he stood up, held them up 1 meter off the ground, and let them drop. And where they landed on a piece of paper, he cut the shape where they landed. These then became the matrix for a new measuring device that is a meter but isn't a meter. Right? Removed from its original context, loses its original meaning. And he calls them the new standard stoppages, because it's right where the string stopped. Does that make sense? Conceptually, at least. I mean, the process itself is fairly straightforward, right? So he took those profiles of the strings, put them onto canvases, traced them there, and used that to cut pieces of wood that he could then use as parts of designs, right? New units of measure based, instead of on rationality, based on chance, right? Now, this is all before the Dada group even forms for the first time in Zurich, right? This kind of proto-Dada. It's a very Dada idea. It's all about chance. It's all about the artist not really touching the design, right? That's all going on here already with Duchamp in 1913, 1914. So, again, taking things, manipulating them, and changing their meaning. After the war, he went back to France. Oh, there's the stoppages as well, right? So you get a sense of this, right? There's one of these in Philadelphia. There's one in MoMA. I think the one on the right is from Philadelphia. This one's in MoMA. One over in San Francisco. We don't have one, right? Sadly. But there we are, the three standard stoppages. In 1919, he went back to Paris, bought a postcard, Mona Lisa, drew a mustache on her, goatee, signed it, this time with his real name, right? And put an inscription at the bottom, LHOOQ, right? Again, a ready-made, but in this case, a ready-made that he doctored a little bit, did more than just sign it. And what he's doing is understanding that by the artist's hand, the object is changed, right? There's a glue that's holding all of this stuff together. By the artist's intervention is maybe a better way of saying it, because sometimes he doesn't touch things, right? By the artist's intervention, the world is changed. The meaning of the world is changed. And I got to think, as somebody who used to be an artist, that's not a bad thing to think. That any of you, I don't care what your major is, by your actions, the world is changed. That's a good positive message, right? To think about. As long as you use it positively and don't go shoot up some church, right? Don't go shoot up nothing, exactly right. Paintballs if you've got to. Okay, LHOQ, again, taking a very recognizable object and altering it in a way. Now, this comes back to Duchamp's sense of humor, right? Not only drawing a mustache and a goatee on Mona Lisa, doing that gender-bending thing that we saw when he wrote in the guise of Beatrice Wood, right? Questioning presumptions, but then calling it LHOOQ. Now, he's picked this up. He's a Frenchman to begin with, and he's picked this up while he's in Paris. And if you say the words letters LHOOQ out loud in French, right? L is pronounced like this, L, right? Or just, I guess it's third. H is H. O is a sort of like O. Is basically pronounced like that, right? So if you say those letters out loud in French, L-A-C-H-O-O-Q. L-A-C-H-O-O-Q. She's got a hot ass. Right? Or alternatively, she has fire in her pants. Right? She is hot in the butt. Right? That's literally what that means. L-A-C-H-O-O-Q. Right? So here's his sense of humor, right? And again, if you think about what a wonderful way, I love this thing, because it's, I think it's something out this door. Or it was for many years, I can't remember if it's still up or not. Again, here's this the central thesis. The intervention of the artist changes the meaning of things. Even if that thing is a work of art already, or a reproduction of a work of art, right? Now, one of the things we'll find is that with Dada artists making non-art, anti-art, the idea of original versus reproduction for them is also kind of, who cares, right? Because it's not really about, because the original is all about artist's hands, right? So why isn't a copy every bit as good as the original? So that's coming up with this as well, right? So you'll never look at Mona Lisa the same way, right? And in many ways, isn't that the agenda of art anyways? Hopefully that we look at our world in a different way. And in this case, poking fun at the these traditions, right? Now we have one Duchamp in the National Gallery. A fairly small work. I'm always surprised when I go at just how big it is. It's about like that, right? Looking like a pair of French doors, right, that you would open up between rooms. All made by a carpenter. Now it's called Fresh Widow, when in fact it's a French window, right? So it's another of his play on words. And this is, he went back to Paris for just like a year, right? He's back in New York when he makes Fresh Widow, right? At the same time, calling it that, and it's labeled, you can see on the bottom, there's the title, Fresh Widow, right? By titling it that, it's also given it some erotic overtones. Because post-war, there were a lot of fresh widows, right? Newly available women who had been happily married beforehand, but their husbands are all dead now, right? So these are fresh widows post-war. And again, I think it's kind of rude, but that's still part of this sort of mocking sense of humor that Duchamp always has, right? Now, for this work, again, it might look like it has more craftsmanship, but all Duchamp did here was give a carpenter the specs. This is how big it's, and he gave it to a professional joiner, right, to put it together for him. Right? Again, for Duchamp, the idea is the most important thing. And this sets the stage for so much later 20th century art. Like right now would be a great time to talk about Jeff Koons, the guy who made the big silver bunnies. Look like balloon bunnies, right? Because he didn't have a thing to do with them. He had the idea, and that was it. And that's not drastically different from Rubens, right? The great Baroque painter. He came up with the ideas, and he had this group full of really talented painters. One of them did animals, and one of them did still lives, and one of them did portraits, right? And they carried out his ideas for him, and then he would sort of fill in about them. And every now and then they painted in his style. Yeah. This is not that different, right, from any of that. He gave the specs to a professional to do. Now, this is important because one of the things we're going to see with Duchamp, and I think you may have gotten some small sense of that already with the stoppages, is there's something about his work that even though he's interested in chance and interested in removing the hand of the artist, there's something incredibly precise about his work. And there's a precision to the execution that wherever possible he will include. And in this case, to get that kind of precision, he gives it to a professional, right? He wants the precision of professional joinery for the windows, right? That's important for him. So the professional carpenter makes this version for him, right? A miniature version of your standard interior French doors. And then, because those are usually glass, what he's done, again, to subvert the original use, is one, obviously it's tiny, so it's not. It's a model. But second, instead of glass, he fills the panes with patent leather, right? Shiny, black, polished leather. Again, you can't see through it, so the original use is utterly subverted, but on the other hand, patent leather, right? Leather. We have to go into sort of erotic connotations of leather as well, right? Having an element of this too. So Duchamp is doing all of these things, right? And he said, he even told as they were building it, right? He didn't put that in there. He told people who were constructing it that he wanted it to be shined every day when it was on display, like shoes are shined. Right? So you should treat it like a pair of shoes. So go out and hit it with the polish every day. And he loves these sort of clothing references, right? And then he signs it. I love this. It's copyrighted, right? Copyright. Now, it's made not by him. It's made by somebody else, by a professional who could make dozens of them. I think there is more than one version. I think they all say copyright, you know. And then he signs it and dates it, but not with his own name, Rose Selavi, right? And dates it. And you'll notice that the signature is not even handmade, right? Everything, there's no sense of the artist's hands. It's stencil cutout letters, right? So everything is sort of prefab with it. Now, again, playing with words, Rose Salavi. Here's a photo of him in the guise. This is what he thought Rose Salavi looked like, so he dressed up as her once. Had a photographer who we'll talk about later today, Man Ray, take a picture of him. And it says down below, lovingly, Rose Salavi. And in this case, he spells Rose with a double R, which he sometimes does, not consistent. We go back again to Duchamp's interest in language, right? Rose Salavi. We go back to his play on words, the puns that he does. Rose Salavi, again in French. Rose, the letter R is Rose, c'est la vie. Eros. And even her name is an anagram of this. In French, if you say Rose, especially with a double R, Eros, erotica. C'est la vie. It's life. So again, a mocking, joking play on words with his names that he's choosing for these things, right? Erotica is life, and that's what he signs this one with. So if we go back to the idea of it being a fresh widow with patent leather, right? It's a statement on erotica, but it's weird because it becomes eroticism transplanted away from organic forms and put onto something that's a precisely rendered and constructed piece of utilitarian stuff, right? In the same way, like with the fountain, you can't get away from the fact that that's something that men bear themselves to, right? There's an undercurrent of nudity and sexuality with that object as well, and that's something that runs rampant through Duchamp's work, is erotic underpinnings. Right? And that brings us to the most important and most famous of all of Duchamp's works. It's just up the street, so to speak, just up 95. It's in Philadelphia. Okay? Philadelphia has an amazing Duchamp collection, the large glass, and it's huge, right? You stand about here, right? That's how big it is. And it's this monster piece of two pieces of industrial glass. It looks like they might have come off of a modern building. Doesn't it look like the door to a bank or something? But in between the glass, he's sandwiched all these things that he's made, that he's painted on translucent pieces of paper or celluloid. Some of them are even found objects sandwiched between the glass. The glass was originally pristine. It was being transported at one point in 1923 to a show, and they dropped it, and it cracked. And Duchamp said, they went, "Oh my God, it's cracked." And he went, "No, now it's done. Now it's finally finished," right? He liked that idea of chance. So, the large glass, the bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even, right? Works on it for the better part of 5 years. Another window metaphor, right? We've seen so many in modern art metaphors, the window as a metaphor for modern existence, right? Going back to Matisse, but certainly others as well. In this case, painted parts cut out, sandwiched between two pieces of glass. And by sandwiching something between glass, you begin to think of it as something else, like a science experiment with a microscope. You know, you put the blood between the slide and the little cover slip, right? And then you can look at it more closely. You can understand how it behaves by sticking it under glass, right? And Duchamp is playing with that idea, the idea of it as a specimen of sorts. The other thing that it brings to mind is that in Duchamp's day, in the early 20th century, the kind of slides that, okay, we're digital now, but when I first started teaching, we taught with slides, right? And you remember these probably from your parents and whatnot, right? Those vacation slides and the Kodak projector, right? Makes all the noise and whatnot. In the early 20th century, those kinds of slides were sandwiched between two pieces of glass, rather than put in paper. And they were bigger, about like yay, right? And negatives that you would use for exposing pictures were often on glass as well, and preserved on glass. So with this, there's also sort of a photographic reference as well. And in fact, Duchamp called it an instantaneous, the French word instantané, which is the French word for snapshot. So he sees this as a snapshot, as a photograph of something, in a way, a specimen, right? And adding to that meaning, if we look in the corner here, these objects are found objects, these 4 disc-shaped objects. All of them are things that were used in optometry shops to test eyesight. So the theme of vision, what you see is taken into effect here. And the fact that with this, you have to look, it's a hard thing to look at because you're always looking through it at the same time you're looking at it, right? So calling it a snapshot, using optometry things inside of it, all of this suggests that there's something here about looking, right? A theme of looking. And the title of it suggests that as well. The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors. Now, do they mean stripped bare as in her suitors went up to the bride and tore off all of her clothes, or do they think, is it about looking and imagining nakedness where there is none, right? The idea of sight is a key part of this. Now, all of the elements that appear in the large glass are excerpted from earlier works that Duchamp had done. So on a certain level, Duchamp is thinking of this snapshot, this specimen, as being a career retrospective. And he's going to go back to his earlier works of art and make reproductions of things and sandwich them in this glass, preserve them, if you will, forever. So if we look through the different elements at the bottom and the top, we can find other works by Duchamp that used those same elements. So I'm going to go to some details of the bottom first, and then we'll work our way to the top, right? So on the left on the bottom, we can see on the left-hand side another of these, a reproduction of this machine that he'd worked on just previously, right? And here it comes this box, right? And he sees it as a sort of a water mill sort of thing that would spin through here but could move on those gliders this way, right? A repurposed reconstruction machine, but interestingly, a machine that doesn't really work, right? It's more or less just the framework for the machine. You can see the water wheel inside of it, right? With the idea that then nature's fluids would power it, right? That's how water wheels work. Same thing as windmills. The air powers it, right? So the paddle wheel on the bottom turns this spindle running through here to do something, right? But we're not 100% sure. In this case, that whole thing reappears here, right? And you'll notice that the axle connects over to this element over here, right? And the top of it has something else added through here, and then the line that goes up, connects to this scissor-like form at the top of it, right? So it's a machine of some sort, powered by fluid, and it derives from this glider that he'd worked on. These are in the same room in Philadelphia, by the way. This is over in the corner, right? So fluids, we'll see, are really sort of a fascinating thing for this work and for Duchamp. The thing that's on top of it is a series of suits, dresses and pants and blouses and robes and whatnot, only rendered somewhat mechanically. And it's almost as if they're on some sort of rack. We can see a spindle coming up the top, a circle here, and a sense that they would spin around as this machine would work. Right? So they're revolving about. And these are certainly, I think, meant to evoke dry cleaners, right? Where suits would spin around, or department stores for a ready-made, right? Because when you're buying a ready-made, you go out and you look at the rack, and you go over, I would go over to the 44 regs, right? And I grab one, and then I go see if it fit or not. That idea here is that's what and he says this is the bachelors, right? Thank you, Morgan. So and by the way, he sort of explains this all on a number of different times, right? So this is the bachelors. They are set in motion by some sort of fluid that drives that water wheel, right? They move around like suits at a cleaner's. As we mentioned, it attaches to this object. This is an earlier painting as well, which is a chocolate grinder, right? The thing that takes the chocolate beans, grinds them up, turns them into the paste that then becomes the chocolate. You add oil and whatnot. And you can see that the bottom of it is driven by the spindle of the water wheel, and the top of it attaches to those scissors that look as if they ought to also, and again, you get this idea of industrial fashion production, right? A machine that would then cut the fabric, right? So it seems as if this water wheel that moves the bachelors also makes the chocolate grinder work. Right? He's seeing this all fit together. And again, this is another reference to courtship, isn't it? Bachelors and the bride suggests courtship. So does chocolate, right? Every February 14th, right? And here's a chocolate grinder at work so you get an idea of what he's made, right? This is what it looks like when a chocolate grinder actually grinds the chocolate. Okay. Over the top are these precisely drawn cones. They sort of look like coffee filters, don't they? For a drip coffee maker, these precisely cones. Duchamp calls them parasols, which are sort of dainty sun umbrellas, right? Not rain umbrellas, but sun umbrellas. A woman on parade being looked at, right? Dressed up to be seen. At another point, when he's explaining it, he calls them sieves, things that strain fluid, right? So there are meanings that are associated with all these things, and they all fit together around the theme of courtship, of the bachelors, the suitors, and the bride up above, right? So the bottom is the zone of the bachelors, the top is the zone of the bride. So if you thought the bottom part was hard to understand, the bride up above even more so. Right? Now, if we know Duchamp's work, we can identify who the bride is. Here's an earlier painting. Duchamp started with the Puteaux group. He was there next to Gris, right, next to Villon, right? In fact, he and Villon are related by marriage. There's a Duchamp-Villon out there as well, right, in that family. But this is now the passage from virgin to bride. This one's in MoMA. And you can see that the forms that he used look kind of like Futurism and kind of like Cubism, right? They give a sense of movement, right? They have a sense of multiple viewpoints. But also, I think you can see that the forms look like chocolate on the chocolate grinder, right? That squeegee effect that you get through areas like right here, right? And there's a signature in the title, the Passage de la Vierge à la Mariée, from the virgin to the bride, to the married bride. And a sense of this figure now moving through space. Now, look over here on the left-hand side, and you can find her. Excerpted from this picture, right? This area here with the crown, the neck, coming over, this area down below becomes here, right? So he's pulled her out of this earlier work and stuck her here. Now let's talk about the earlier work, kind of, because I think it's an important issue for him. Duchamp is interested in the effects of the mind more than the hand. What is the passage from virgin to bride? It's a change in mindset. It's what happens wedding night. You pass from being a virgin to being a bride. One does, right? The woman does. Through the intervention of the man. Right? He's a sexist. Yeah? So this is really, even though the figure seems to be moving, the kind of time elapsing that is important for Duchamp is the elapsing of a mental state from one thing to another, to the realization of who you are And for a young woman on a wedding night in the early 20th century, it's that change from a mindset that says I am unmarried and a virgin to I am now married and no longer a virgin. And a change in mindset, a change in character. And that's the figure that appears here. So again, it's this idea of the bachelors, the suitors, and sex being a hallmark of what Duchamp is working with here, right? It's no accident that the form of the bride looks like a praying mantis. Because the praying mantis, they eat their mates, right? When they have sex, they devour their lovers. Down below, the bachelors are attached to scissors, right? Castration anxieties and whatnot, right? This is full of sort of really fascinating ideas about what sex is to both genders, right? Change in mindset for a woman and a threat to masculinity on some levels, or a threat to life for men. What else? The stuff around her, behind her, and down below is meant to be her clothes. So she has been quite literally stripped bare. In French, mise à nu, right? Made naked by her bachelors. Whether she's meant to be physically that way or we're seeing what the bachelors are imagining is left open. Coming from the bride is this shape that stretches across the entire top. And the outline of the shape almost looks like a spreading puddle of something. Again, fluids. Whereas inside of it, 3 sections have been cut out. And they look sort of randomly drawn, almost as if maybe they were dropped and then cut from where they fell, like Arp's work, for example. But the fact that it's this elongated shape with these openings cut in the middle make it look quite a bit like a head gasket off of an automobile engine. Right, so here's the gasket that fits between the head and the engine block, right? And the openings for the pistons that drive the machine. Duchamp is playing with these ideas of fluids and fuels and machines related to erotic activity throughout the entire work. Let's see where I am coming up here. And I've got some quotes from him about that. He calls this her halo. Right? He calls this the halo of the bride and the result of her being stripped by the bachelors. He even says it's the most important part of the painting. He still calls it a painting, right? That gasket form is the most important part. And I think that it is in a way because it's conceptually the most important part. We've seen a number of places where fluids seem to play a role, right? And he calls the bride, as he's explaining it, a magneto for desire, a desire magneto. Do you know what a magneto is? It's a part of an old engine. Back in the day, before automobile engines had batteries, the electricity was generated by something called a magneto, which is one part of the engine spins. That's why you used to have to crank them to get them started. And that would generate energy that would then begin the process of combustion, right? So my Vespa, my 66 Vespa still has a magneto on it, right? They still use them, then there's no place on that thing for a battery, right? It means anybody could walk off with it at any point because it doesn't even need a key, right? It's all based on the magneto. And he says that she's a magneto, so she provides the electricity, right? That makes the engine run. And the engine we've seen is this machine down below, right? And here, let's get that now so we can look at it. So up above is the bride. She's the desire magneto, and she propels the engine. She provides the electricity. He also says that in addition to supplying the electricity, she also supplies the gasoline. That's his word. She provides the love gas for the bachelors. So she is everything that makes the machinery that we see down below actually run. And he says that this love gasoline is secreted by her sexual glands. right? And Hunter, that look is perfect for this because it's like, but you know what? It's the interesting thing about it is that first, I think it's fascinating. I don't buy half of it, right? But what I do buy is the thought that went into it. That for him, it means this. We can take that away. It means this for him. And that being a Dada artist, he's trying to confound us. In fact, one of Duchamp's statements is that I'm not a Dada artist, which is what a Dada artist would probably say, right? Right. So when he explains meanings, part of the point is to sort of not really spell it out for you, but just to give you these little pieces of kindling that you can light a fire with, right? These little building blocks that you can put together into various things, right? But all of them relate to things that we see Duchamp doing throughout his entire career, which is playing with the thoughts of how an artist changes materials to make them into something else, and how the act of doing that has erotic overtones. And in the history of art, it always has. Creation has always been told. Salvation has been told with a story that has to do with gods and men coming together to give birth. That's part of what creation is all about. It's what the word genius is about. It's about insemination. And Duchamp is tying into those ideas. We just don't question them other places because they're not stripped bare, dare I say. That just came, that's not my nose. But they're not laid bare for us in the same way. We don't think of, the birth of Venus as being some god's semen that's thrown into the ocean. Right? When we think of the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, we don't think of it as a physical act. Right? Duchamp won't let us get away with that. Right? That all creation is an act with sexual overtones. You're giving part of yourself over to something else. You're planting a seed somewhere. And I'm telling you some male terms. You can do it planting an egg somewhere, and it will grow. Right? On the piece of paper, on the canvas. There's a place for it to grow. So he really is playing, right, with these incredible ideas, right? Right. So, again, he sees the large glass as a machine of sorts, right? Driven by the bride up above, powered by some sort of fluid, right, that has to relate to sexual interaction, if not intercourse, right? Bachelors down below, bride up above. Two things before the day is over. First, again, Marcel is a wordsmith. Duchamp is a wordsmith. In French, the bride stripper, the mariée mise à nu by her bachelors, célibataire, even. Right? The top is the mariée, and the bottom is her bachelors. La mariée célibataire. Marcel. It's a self-portrait, right? In its way, given that it is an artistic self-portrait that lifts things from everything he'd been working on to that point. And when he was finished, right, he made two different versions of it, available to everybody, mass-produced, not to scale. One of them was in a green box, right? And on the green box, it said Marcel in two different sections, just like this, Mar and Cel. Right? Mariée célibataire, right? And there were drilled holes in the box. You open it up, and what was inside was a reproduction of this and documents that led to its creation, including reproductions of all the works that Dada said as well, and his handwritten notes, quasi-explaining it, right? So he reproduces it for everybody because art doesn't have to be original, right? Art doesn't have to be the hand of the artist. It can be mass-produced. He also came out with another version where the entire thing was boxed in a little suitcase, like a traveling salesman would carry, and a miniature version of not only this work, but everything he'd ever done in this one little box, the boîte en valise, the box in a suitcase, right? And the idea is that this little boîte en valise is exactly what like a, you ever see these on like, I don't know, Antiques Roadshow, where somebody's got these little miniature typewriters that they found that were old traveling salesman's models, right? And they would keep them in a little box. And you would have these little models, and this is what you would buy. Buy it by something, you'll get it, and this is, you know, what a new Underwood typewriter looks like. Right? Or what else might it be? It might be kitchenwares or, you know, dishes, but in miniature, so you had a sense of the style, right? That would be then carried from door to door, and that's exactly the model for this. The boîte en valise. It came in 3 colors. One was wood, one was covered in green fabric, and one was covered in red fabric. Right? So there's one of them up at the Baltimore Museum of Art and one in the National Gallery. It's not out that often because it's pretty fragile. Pretty fragile. And I've got a video of how it opens up in just a second, but as you look at it, and you see it open, you start to see everything we've been looking at. Reproduced for you in miniature, you know, to be sold in mass production. So not only do we have the large glass right in the middle, but we have a reproduction of the bachelors on the far right. You can see the bride on the left. You can see our fresh widow on the ground. I'll bring up details of these. Right there's LHOOQ on the far right. Right? Everything. I want one of these. Right? I would totally. In fact, there was a reproduction made in the 80s. It's going for like $750. So if you guys really want to bribe your professor, right? Get me the reproduction of this. So there we can see closely that there's our urinal, right? There's a typewriter. Ha! Look, I didn't mention it, but there's another wood typewriter cover right here. But there's our little fountain. This is one of his other Dada works. It's a glass. It's a chemist's glass tube, and it says 50 milliliters of Parisian air. Right, and that's all it is. He just got these things. That's what he labeled them. 50 milliliters of Parisian air. Right. Paintings reproduced with. There's the bride appears again. Here she is. Right. What's that? From his early period of doing these Cubist works. If you look closely, you see you get your own set of standard stoppages, right? Only not a meter long because they're done in miniature. And you get reproductions of all of the works, the Fresh Widow, LHOOQ, right? And here I thought it was worth spending. Let's see if this is going to work or not. I think I got to try and get over there with it to click on this. I don't want to do that. I want to play. I got to hit that. It's supposed to play. You're supposed to play for me. Don't do that. No. Where was I? I was back a slide. Hang on a second. Bip. Now we'll try that one more time. I think it's worthwhile seeing it in action. There. Chocolate grinder. Standard stoppages. And you can see it actually is a see-through glass, just like the large glass is, right? So, just to see what they look like in action. Come back over here. So Duchamp is the centerpiece of New York Dada, right? Another artist who's there is Francis Picabia, another French artist who emigrated around the same time as Duchamp did. They had known each other back in Paris. They were both part of the Puteaux group. They were both part of the Golden Section, working in this sort of quasi-cubist fashion. Now, when we talked about that group, all we really talked about were the Orphists, right? That's really what we focused on. But there were other members of that Cubist offshoot group that weren't really Orphists, right? Apollinaire kind of gave that term to everybody, but there were some people that didn't share every one of their concerns. And Duchamp and Picabia were two of the people that were sort of off on their own, right? So Duchamp's most famous work, other than the large glass, is the nude descending the staircase, where you can see the figure go up the stairs and kind of around the staircase to the left into the upper left corner. Right? And again, a sort of a mechno figure that looks kind of like something the Futurists would do, because she looks a little bit robotic as she comes down the stairs. But again, in that yellowish brown that for Duchamp is chocolate, right, is courtship. Picabia also works with the idea of movement through space. In this case, a procession that he saw on his honeymoon when he was in Spain of a series of religious figures moving through a landscape. And so he's cubified that, right? Made it cubist and then staggered it through the landscape, moving from lower left to upper right. They're both working, as I said, in Puteaux, and they are both part of that big show where Apollinaire named the group the Orphists. And these two paintings hung next to each other, side by side. The next year, they were both included in a show in New York in 1913. And I can't remember if I have this on the slide or not. We'll have more of a chance to talk about this. I do, I think. The Armory Show. In 1913, a bunch of gallery owners got together and organized a major exhibition in New York City called the Armory Show. Now, the Armory Show was an annual exhibition, but that year what they were going to try and do with the Armory Show in 1913 is introduce American artists to all this wonderful stuff that's going on in Europe. Bring modern art to America. And at that point in history, in 1913, most American artists are still sort of doing 19th century social realism kind of pictures, gritty scenes of urban life. And they're really beautiful, right? But they're not particularly modern in their way. And the Armory Show was intended by a bunch of gallery owners, right? Other people interested in modern art to try to open people's eyes to what's going on in the rest of the world. And these two pictures were there. It was a huge, the avant-garde people loved it, but of course the press hated it, right? And one of the things they hated most of all was nude descending the staircase, because they didn't get it, right? But in 1913, at the Armory Show, these two works again hung side by side, right next to each other, right? And presented the works of Picabia and Duchamp both to the New York audience. And that scandal that was caused by that show is, I think, part of what attracted Duchamp, because you get the sense from all this stuff that he loves himself a good scandal, right? In fact, 1918, 1920, he sort of stopped making art altogether. He just gave it up. And he decided he was going to become an international chess master. Because the life of the mind, right? Where every move is thoughtfully. And there are these pictures of him for the rest of his life trying to become a first-ranked chess player, right? Turns out he was working on something in his barn that's in Philadelphia that's really, really creepy. The Étoile Donnée, and it's now installed in Philadelphia, but nobody knew he was even He was just going back to, and he was remarketing things, right?
How creepy.
Creepy. I'll tell you what, it's not set up for this, and we're out of time, so I will bring in the Étoile Monet, and then we'll talk about the company, okay? Again, we're running behind, but I'm okay with that, if you guys are okay with that. We're gonna look more at data, because I think this is really important stuff, and on Friday, I might want to, I'm debating on whether or not one of our data artists, American data artists, his name is Emmanuel Radnitsky, a Man Ray, photographer named Man Ray, made movies as well, and this is wonderful. It's like 16-minute long silent movie that he made in 1926. And I'm tempted to show it to you because I think we should just see things that aren't just necessarily, or already we're seeing things that aren't necessarily painting, right, and sculpture in the classical sense of things. I'm debating if we got the time for that. I've played with that. So Friday we'll wrap up data. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to get through the rest of data and move on to surrealism. I'm running behind on peer editing your data essay.
Okay, we got it.
I've got them, but I think I said, I got a box full of them. Yeah. So don't worry if you haven't heard from me because there's just a bunch of other things going down right now.
Yep.
And I will be getting on them maybe tomorrow morning before my back-to-back-to-back meetings tomorrow. So, okay? But, so I'm sorry about that. Hey!
Is there any time I can meet with you this week for my
Sorry?
progress report?
I haven't seen you yet. I'd like to see you.
Yeah, is there any time this week that would be like?
Hang on, so let me just do this. If I do this
Yeah,
wrong,
no
I'm going to
problem.
ruin my recording.